This is Focus on Africa from BBC World News. I'm Sophie Ikenye. Our top stories: a political standoff. The president of Guinea Bissau names a new prime minister, but the incumbent refuses to step aside after being sacked. Zimbabwe gets set to introduce new domestic coins and banknotes in a bid to curb the cash crisis. Also in the program, measuring the damage done by oil spills. A leading UK Anglican cleric says oil exploration in Nigeria is causing an environmental genocide. We hear from those suffering its effects.
It's the oil. Even if you manage to catch a fish, it's not fit to eat.
And in sports, I'm the best Africa has ever had, and now I want to be the best coach. Ex-Cameroon international Samuel Eto'o speaks on his future. Well, thanks for joining us on Focus on Africa from BBC World News. There is a political standoff in Guinea-Bissau after the president named a new prime minister and sacked his predecessor, who was refusing to step down. Now, the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, has called the president's decision illegal and affirmed its support for the now former prime minister. Now, all this is happening just 3 weeks before the presidential election is up. Well, let's find out what's going on with me is Lamine Konkobo from BBC Afrique. Lamine, what is happening? What's going on?
Well, you said it. The president decided to sack his prime minister. President Jose Mario Vaz decided to sack his prime minister, and he did so in circumstances, of course, where the ECOWAS is saying that it is illegal. He did so. He took the decision on Monday to sack the prime minister, and a day later, on Tuesday, he signed a decree designating a successor, Faustino Ndutembale. And this guy is waiting actually to become the next head of the government, and the sacked prime minister is saying, I'm not going anywhere.
So now ECOWAS is stepping in saying the decision is illegal. How significant is this?
It is very significant because the ECOWAS means business when it says it is illegal and you have to listen to us and reinstate the president. They are threatening to impose sanctions like freezing the freezing of the assets of the President Vaz, and restricting or banning travels for him. And of course, why they want to do that? The president actually took the decision to sack a prime minister in a parliamentary system where, you know, it is not up to the president to decide actually who becomes, prime minister, but to the people. And the prime minister that has been sacked belongs to the party who has majority in parliament.
Can he be forced to reinstate him?
Well, I mean, he has the choice.
Decide to do
he
that.
has the choice to do so, or actually go against the constitution itself. But if he doesn't, he will probably have to face consequences. And this, the ECOWAS means business, because they have been involved in finding a solution to previous crises in Guinea-Bissau, and they do not want to actually stand aside and see their efforts in the past actually be wasted by the desire of a president who probably is afraid that he might lose the upcoming elections.
All right. So why is the stability of Guinea-Bissau important, Lamine?
It is very important. Under the former president, the country was declared a failed state, where anything actually could be done there that goes against the law. It became a hub for narco traffickers from Latin America, and people who actually traveled from the region into Europe actually during that period would have experienced close scrutiny when they got to Heathrow or Paris, Charles de Gaulle airport, where, of course, customs officer, fearing that probably you have been too close to the narco traffickers there or drug peddlers there, you might have been bringing something in. So it is very important, because the country, if it fails back again, might actually become an open gate for the narco traffickers again. Yeah.
All right. Lamine Konkobo, always nice to speak to you. Thank you. Thank you. Now, the Archbishop of York, Dr. John Sentamu, says that a slow environmental genocide is taking place in Nigeria's Bayelsa state. Now, he spoke in an exclusive interview with the BBC as part of a commission investigating oil spills in the Niger Delta. Dr. John Sentamu said that oil companies needed to end a culture of double standards in Nigeria. Now, crude oil production is estimated to be 300 million litres per day, making up to 70% of the Nigerian government's revenue. Now, spills in Niger Delta are common, with over 40 million litres of crude oil said to be spilled annually. Now, a 2018 study claimed there have been over 12,000 oil spills incidents in the oil-rich Niger Delta between 1976 and 2014. Pipeline corrosion and tanker accidents were said to have caused more than 50% of oil spills. Other incidents can be attributed to operational error, mechanical failure, and sabotage. Well, the BBC's Mayeni Jones travelled with the Commission earlier this year and sent this report.
This was once a thriving ecosystem, but oil spills have devastated these shores.
It's the oil. It's the oil. Even if you manage to catch a fish, it's not fit to eat. There are a few that are okay, and that's what we eat. But on others, their heads are the only things that are left. They are so slim. They have no flesh. So it's hard for us to feed ourselves.
Bayelsa was where oil was first discovered in Nigeria in the 50s. It's completely changed the lives of these communities.
The waterways of Bayelsa State are essential to the way people live here. They bathe in it, it's the source of their livelihood, it's where a lot of their food comes from. So oil spills can mean devastation, not just financially, but also in terms of their health.
According to the Bayelsa State Oil and Environmental Commission, chaired by the Archbishop of York, oil companies are ultimately responsible for the environmental damage here. They want to set up guidelines for oil extraction that will protect local communities.
You know, people talk about environmental degradation. I think that's too weak a phrase. For me, really, as I've looked at the environment and as I've looked at people's lives, I've come to the conclusion that this is a very slow environmental genocide, really.
But the oil companies say many spills are caused by vandals tampering with their installations. Local activists believe they have their reasons.
The youths are angry. We have graduates of all sorts of life. We have skilled men, skilled boys, young boys and girls. People are hungry. People are suffering. We see crude passing through our land, and at the end, we are not beneficiaries to this national wealth. How do you expect the youths to feel? How do you expect these people to survive?
Oil spills have been happening in the Niger Delta for decades. With the attention of the international community very much elsewhere, it's unclear who will enforce the Commission's new guidelines. But if nothing changes, the prospects for future generations here are unlikely to improve. Mayeni Jones, BBC News, Bayelsa.
Well, with me in studio is Matthew Renshaw, a solicitor at Lide. That's a law firm that won a landmark case against Shell. Thanks for taking time to talk to us and Focus on Africa. So this commission intends to draw a new legal framework. What's the most important thing that they should include?
I mean, I think in many ways the legal framework is there. It's about the implementation of that framework which is lacking. Mm-hmm. And there have been, I mean, over the years, numerous reports highlighting chronic oil pollution in the Niger Delta. The UN Environmental Programme did a really detailed study in 2011. They found there was chronic oil pollution in Ogoniland. Their conclusion was it's a fair assumption that most members of the current Ogoniland community have lived with chronic oil pollution throughout their lives.
So implementation of it is the problem, but who is supposed to implement it? Are you saying Nigeria itself should be implementing it, or what's?
No, I'm saying the oil companies. Uh-huh. So for example, in Nigerian law, the oil company, the operator of the pipeline, is obliged to clean up an oil spill. Mm-hmm. And for example, Shell have global expertise and capacity to clean up oil spills, but for whatever reason in the Niger Delta it's not done properly. Or you've got aging pipelines, aging infrastructure that needs updating, and again, for whatever reason, that simply isn't done. So fundamental things like having a leak detection system, so they can tell when a leak happens, That isn't in place on lots of pipelines in the Niger Delta. So it feels very much as if the legal framework is there, the standards, it's known what standards should be adhered to, but those standards in Nigeria are not adhered to in the way they would be in other countries.
You won a landmark case against Shell, and you managed to get quite a large sum of money as compensation for people. What was the biggest challenge for you in that case?
So we were representing about 15,000 individuals. So it was a large case. So that's always challenging. It was two spills in 2008 and 2009. At the start of the case, Shell was saying these were two very small spills that they'd completely cleaned up in 2009. They offered the community of 15,000 people £4,000 to settle that case, to finish that case. About 3 or 4 years later, the evidence demonstrated that actually these were two very large spills that had devastated the environment of this community. And eventually that case settled for £55 million, only though because the community had the opportunity to bring their case here in the UK courts.
Away from Nigeria.
Exactly.
All right, Matthew Renshaw, thank you very much indeed for your thoughts on this very important story. Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you. Now, Zimbabwe is to have new banknotes in the next fortnight. Authorities outlawed the US dollar as legal tender in June after over a decade of use. But with the country facing its worst economic crisis in a decade and inflation now at 300%, will these new notes face old problems? The BBC's Shingai Nyoka reports from Harare.
New banknotes were inevitable after the reintroduction of the Zimbabwe dollar. They said it was a return to normalcy and that no country could thrive without its own currency. Zimbabwe is in the throes of a cash crisis. The ATMs haven't worked in years and most people have been unable to withdraw their cash from the banks. The little that's available in hard notes is bought and sold on the black market for a premium. There have been several currency changes since the economy crashed over a decade ago. Different notes issued to cope with inflation. In 2008, inflation reached 500 billion%, according to the IMF. The most recent currency change was in 2016, with the introduction of a quasi-currency called the bond note that was supposed to trade on par with the US dollar. It rapidly lost its value, but is still available. And the announcement of new notes has been greeted with a high degree of skepticism.
There's just no trust anymore. The situation will just revert to what it was. The new currency will be in short supply again, and people will trade it on the black market.
The problem is not with the currency, the problem is with the confidence. We're not confident with what the government is doing. All the measures that they have been trying to do since last year, they're not working.
The government says they will take a conservative approach to releasing the new notes to avoid inflation. But already the reincarnated Zimbabwe dollar has lost 15-fold its value since it was introduced.
The regular person on the street not being able to access cash sort of breeds that mental, let me say, skepticism, which then breeds into the impulses and behavior that we're seeing, which sort of cause the greater collapse, which is inflation, speculation, hoarding commodities, and things of that nature. So hopefully these things will strike at the psyche and build that everyday confidence at the micro level.
The country is battling an economic crisis once again, the worst in a decade. This week, fuel prices rose by 12%, the second increase in a month. The cost of electricity has tripled this month. Many Zimbabweans believe that mismanagement is largely to blame for the economic woes and that another new currency is unlikely to change much. Shingai Nyoka, BBC News, Harare.
This is Focus on Africa from BBC World News. Still to come, sports. As South Africa prepare for the final of the Rugby World Cup, we hear from a former Springbok player and winner about his best moment in the sport. I'm Sophie Ikenye and you're watching Focus on Africa from BBC World News. Now, South African police have arrested dozens of foreign nationals occupying an office building in Cape Town as part of a sit-in protest against xenophobia. Now, hundreds of asylum seekers have been camping at the UN Refugee Agency's offices in South Africa's capital, Pretoria, as well as the coastal city of Cape Town since October the 8th. Well, let's bring in the BBC's Milton Nkosi, who's been following developments for us from Johannesburg. Milton, what's going on? What happened?
Well, Sophie, according to the South African police, who issued a statement today, is that they said that they arrested 100 people because they were actually implementing a court order to evict about 300 refugees who had camped outside a 12-story building in Cape Town known as the World of Arcade. In there are offices of the United Nations, and they had been there, as you just correctly pointed out, from the 8th of October. And the landlord had decided that they needed to be evicted. So the police were evicting these refugees who had come to ask the UN to send them to other countries because they fear for their lives here in South Africa, following those xenophobic attacks we saw in the last few weeks.
So what's been the UN's response to this call to be relocated?
The United Nations and the South African Human Rights Council have said that they have nowhere to take these refugees. They are sympathetic to their plight, but there is freedom of movement in the country. Therefore, they could go to wherever they wanted. And there was no clarity on whether everyone who was camping outside the World of Arcade in Cape Town was indeed a refugee. There were a lot of men and women there who said they wanted to be moved to other countries. And the police said that they were just implementing a court order which was attained by the landlord from a judge.
And Milton, it was, as you say, a court order that was being implemented, but I wonder what people make about the manner in which this was conducted, was done.
Yes, the South African Human Rights Commission said that they plead with the police to carry out their duties with in a humanely fashion, to make sure that they do not hurt particularly women and children as they execute their day-to-day duties. So there was a plea that they needed to be more gentle, if you like, but the people who were protesting, who were staging that sit-in, were refusing to leave the building.
All right, Milton Nkosi for us there in Johannesburg. Thank you. Now, in Cameroon, the death toll from Monday's landslide has risen to 42 people. The landslide happened in Bafoussam, which is in the west of the country. Following heavy rains, the land gave way, crashing houses below. Now, authorities have asked people to vacate the area as heavy rain continues. Well, the BBC's Kilan Gala has more on this.
Well, what we know for now is that 42 people have died following the landslide that swept through the Ngwashia community in Cameroon's western region. 8 people have been rescued and 13 people are still missing, and that tells you that there is a possibility we are going to see even more corpses uprooted from the ground. The landslide struck on Monday night, sweeping across the area, burying 130 homes and completely destroying property. And this is an area where people were not supposed to construct in the first place, because the authorities have told people that you do not construct on hilly areas or on marshy areas. But usually these laws are hardly enforced. So we are seeing a blame game where the authorities are blaming the population for constructing on an area where they have been told not to construct. But the population are now telling the government that they should have enforced the law. What the authorities have done now is that they've created a sort of security cordon around the area, and they've told people to leave that particular area because there is still fear that more landslides will occur in the days ahead because the rains are still very much around. Kilian Gala, BBC News, Yaoundé.
You're watching BBC Focus on Africa. Let's find out what's happening in sport.
Many thanks, Sophie. Now, Cameroon legend Samuel Eto'o says he's targeting a coaching role following his retirement as a player. The 38-year-old's career spanned more than 20 years, in which he won 18 major trophies, including 2 Champions Leagues with Barcelona and another with Inter Milan. He also won the Africa Cup of Nations twice with Cameroon, as well as Olympic gold in 2000. Now he says he wants to win as much as a coach as he did as a player.
Je suis quelqu'un des défis.
I am someone who loves a challenge and I love football. I know that my next challenge would be a coach at the very least, to win as a coach like I did as a player. But I would like to do it on this continent, in Europe, and then one day go back to Africa to try to win there.
He actually does go on to say he's Africa's best ever player. Now, Ghana coach Kwesi Appiah has called up 7 new faces to his squad for November's Africa Cup of Nations qualifiers. The Black Stars host South Africa on the 14th of November and then travel to Sao Tome and Principe 4 days later. Among the new faces in the squad are 2 players at African clubs outside Ghana, goalkeeper Razak Abalora and Tanzania's Azam, and forward Tariq Jebrin, who plies his trade with TP Mazembe in the DR Congo. Andre Ayew, Jordan Ayew and Mubarak Wakaso have all been named as well. Now, on Saturday morning, it's England versus South Africa in the final of the Rugby World Cup. England have won it once, the Springboks twice, including in 2007. One player who also made his little moment of history in that team was former wing Brian Habana. His 8 tries in that tournament equaled the single tournament record set by Jonah Lomu in 1999. So, was winning the World Cup the highlight of his career?
I'm Brian Habana, former South African rugby player. I was named after Brian Robson and Gary Bailey, 2 Manchester United sporting legends. Grew up wanting to be the next South African export into the Premiership as a soccer player. And 1995 was an absolutely symbolic watershed moment in my life. I'd really not known about rugby before that point, even though my dad was a very avid and keen rugby supporter. He allowed us to do what we want to do, and I just enjoyed playing soccer, I enjoyed running, and my dad took me out of school for the first time ever. We took a road trip down to Cape Town to watch the opening game of the Rugby World Cup, where South Africa played the then world champions Australia at Newlands, which is potentially one of the most historic rugby venues globally. And for me as a 12-year-old boy, being able to see grown men of different colours, of different race, painted with a new South African flag on their face, embracing, crying tears of joy at that instance was incredibly monumental in terms of the burning desire that it started lighting inside of me. I was one of the fortunate few, 65,000, sitting in that stadium when Joel Stransky kicked that dropkick over, where the late, great Nelson Mandela walked out onto Ellis Park with that number 6 Springbok jersey, over his head, and handed Francois Pienaar the cup. And Francois' famous words of, "It wasn't for the 65,000 people in the stadium, it was for 45 million South Africans supporting them," inspired me to think, geez, I would love to do what this group of 22 men had been able to achieve. There's moments throughout the course of that 8-week period that, are vividly etched into the back of my mind for forever. You dream of becoming a Springbok in South Africa, you dream of becoming, that famous rugby player. And I think for me, seeing that point come to fruition in November in 2004 and getting to wear the Springbok jersey for the first time against the then world champions England at the home of rugby Twickenham, and then being able to score a try with my first touch of the ball in international rugby sort of laid the foundation for the rest of my rugby career. And yes, there was winning trophies, winning World Cups was fantastic, but that moment on its own was pretty amazing for me.
And for me, that picture back there says it all. What a great player he was. Sophie, will you be watching the rugby final on Saturday?
I think I will. I think after what he said, I think I will. And
you better watch it, because I'm going to ask you questions on Monday.
Thanks for the support, Peter. And don't forget, you can get in touch with me and some of the team on social media. I'm at Kenya. Thanks for your company.